I'm excited to welcome you to Session 3, Governing the Machine, Aspiration as Architecture. My name is Fischer Argosino, and I'm a graduate student in the MIT Technology and Policy Program, class of 2026, and my research focuses on sustainable energy policy, affordability, and poverty. In particular, I hope to build a career that contributes towards leading an equitable, community-centered clean energy transition. This session explores the historical design and architecture of the internet and the evolving dynamics of global digital ecosystems, with a focus on the societal implications and governance of emerging digital technological systems. Panelists will explore the foundational dynamics at the intersection of technological design, tech policy, economics and capital, and explore how diverse actors within a global digital ecosystem behave, misbehave, and interact. We are honored to begin with a keynote address by Dr. David Clark, who earned his PhD in '73, senior research scientist at the MIT Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. Dr. Clark has been a pioneering leader in the design and development of the internet. From 1981 to 1989, he acted as chief protocol architect in this development and chaired the Internet Activities Board. His design research looks at redefining the architectural underpinnings of the internet and the relation of technology and architecture to economic, societal, and policy considerations. His current research focuses on trust, governance, and the future of digital infrastructure. Following the keynote, we will transition into a panel discussion featuring a distinguished group of MIT and TPP alumni whose research spans computer science, cybersecurity, ethics, and digital policy. Dr. Francisco Martin Martinez will be our moderator, who is a postdoc, and is a senior lecturer in natural sciences and computational chemistry in the Department of Chemistry and an affiliate member of the King's Institute for Artificial Intelligence. His interdisciplinary research bridges computational modeling, sustainable materials science, and responsible AI development. The panelists will be Dr. Marzyeh Ghassemi, who is an associate professor in the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science and the Institute for Medical Engineering and Science at MIT. Her research focuses on machine learning for health with an emphasis on algorithmic fairness, interpretability, and ethical AI. Next is Dr. Cecilia Testart, TPP alum, and who is an associate professor in the School of Cybersecurity and Privacy and the School of Computer Science at Georgia Tech. Her work examines the governance of digital platforms, privacy, and societal implications of algorithmic systems. Nathan Fruchter, TPP as well, is a privacy engineer at Google. His work focuses on privacy-preserving technologies, data governance, and the ethical deployment of machine learning systems in consumer platforms. His expertise lies at the intersection of policy, computing, decision science, and human behavior. We look forward to a rich and thought-provoking discussion on the implications and trajectories of emerging digital technologies and ecosystems. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Dr. David Clark. Following his remarks, we will begin our panel discussion moderated by Dr. Francisco Martin Martinez. Okay.
That was mine. Yes, they asked me if I'd give a little talk to start off, talking about my own experience. The topic of the session is governance of the machine. That was the title. I'm going to get to governance, but I want to start by talking about my own experience and how it shaped my understanding of governance, and in particular policy more broadly, where I mean all of the decisions that are made by different stakeholders to shape how technology is developed and used and how it has an impact on society. My background is the design of the internet. As he said, I've been at MIT since I got my PhD here in 1973, so I've been here a bit longer than TPP. That was the year 73 that Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn proposed the design of the internet. I joined the design committee around 1975. I chaired the committee until about 1989, at which point I went off and worked on technology again. My work at the time seemed purely technical. I'd never heard of TPP. I want to make a technical point about the internet because this will help in my comments. We designed what I might call the data carriage layer of the internet. Data was broken into packets. That doesn't really matter here, but what that layer did was move bytes. And on top of that, we have the apps. That's not a word I knew in 1975, but it's the apps that the users interact with, and it's the apps that create the internet experience. So I want to distinguish between the internet as a technology layer and the internet as experience. And with the exception of a few early apps like email, we weren't designing apps. We were just designing the platform. Now, we didn't use the word policy, but the internet is definitely not value neutral. We baked in some very deep values into the internet. One goal was that any set of willing endpoints, that is to say attached computers, could exchange packets. You didn't have to have permission to send something to somebody. We're dealing with that. Another goal was the packet transport layer of the internet was as general as possible to support as wide range of applications as possible. We were hooking general purpose computers together, so why not build a general purpose network? Now that idea is obvious now, but in the 1970s, that was a radical idea. The opposite extreme was the telephone network, which was designed for one known purpose, which was to carry voice calls, and they didn't want it used for anything else. And the folks in the telephone sector, when we told them we were building a network without knowing what it was for, thought we were crazy. But okay, so that's why the network was not built by the telephone company. The goals I mentioned before led to a perhaps more general objective for the internet, which is permissionless innovation. That was a term we did use. We didn't want companies like internet service providers, although we didn't know that word back then, to be able to limit what users could do or monetize what users could do. The goal was part of our techno-optimism of the time, which was that giving every user a voice, every user the ability to communicate at will with the world, was a transformative and also a beneficial outcome. There was one explicit example of policy with a capital P that I wanted to mention. It shaped the early internet, and this has to do with security. And I just have to say this because there's this myth that the internet was designed by academics who didn't care about security, and nothing could be further from the truth. That's nutty. The internet development was funded by the Department of Defense, Defense Advanced Project DARPA. The military network that was supposed to come out was going to be used for tactical warfare. We knew that it was going to be attacked by hostile state actors. This was completely clear. However, that was the military version. The policy decision that was imposed on us by the government was that the civilian version of the internet would not be secure so the intelligence community could spy on it. That's not a surmise. They said it. And they enforced this by prohibiting us from using encryption in the design of network protocols until around 2000, which is 25 years after we started the design, by which point most of our design decisions were baked in. When we live to that, we live with the consequence of that today. As the internet evolved during the 1980s, it did grow a governance model. Although we didn't call it that. It was an open standard-setting body. It was a venue where anybody could attend, but you had to earn the right to be listened to. This is meritocracy. This was and is the Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF, and all of its working groups, and it still functions today, and I think it still functions surprisingly well. I want to move on to the 1990s, where I had a moment that expanded my understanding of the future trajectory of technology. I'm going to tell you a story I've told many times. Around 1995, I was talking to an economist who had a deep understanding of the internet, and the conversation went as follows. Economist said, the internet is about routing money. Routing packets is a side effect, and you screwed up the money routing protocols. That wasn't the word he used. And I said, I didn't design any money routing protocols, and he said, that's what I said. That conversation was joking around, of course, but it was actually a transformative conversation because what I realized was it was money that was shaping the future, so I hired an economist to work for me. That was the beginning of my interdisciplinary misbehavior. Now, let me state an important lesson here, which is if you're talking about regulating or defining or governing the rules and norms for money routing, those rules are critical to the success and stability of any part of a system that is not totally centralized. Let me explain what I mean by that. Facebook is centralized. It's under control of a Facebook czar, Google. But the internet is decentralized. There's 75,000 autonomous systems in the internet. And there are norms and rules. I could talk about the fact some of them are sort of feeble, but that I don't have them running out. There's a really intimidating clock down there. And so I'm going to run over, but not by too much. Don't panic. And in a decentralized system, Okay. You have to have rules and norms for how they can route money, not just packets. How does people get paid? Of course, the most important decentralized system on the internet is the World Wide Web. Anybody can run a browser, a server, all this kind of stuff. I wanted to talk about a system you may not have thought about quite as much, which is the domain name system, which is highly decentralized. Lots of companies out there called registrars sell domain names, and there are registries that keep track of them. And at the top is the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which sort of oversees the whole thing. The packet routing protocols, that is to say how you resolve a name when you look it up in the DNS, those belong to the IETF. But the money routing protocols are defined by ICANN. And they are embedded in the contracts that you sign when you want to be a registry or a registrar. And because they're embedded in contracts, they're stable. Now, nobody likes them. Everybody, well, I'd like the rules different so I can make more money. But because everybody knows the rules, they can come into the ecosystem, they can understand how to enter, and they can understand how to make money. And that's critical. The ability of an actor to understand how to make money if they participate in a decentralized system is critical to its viability, and therefore governance of the technology is often driven by governance of the money. Let me make a related comment about governance, because that's really intimidating clock. Let me give you a related comment about governance. Governance of a decentralized system like the internet itself, or the DNS, or the World Wide Web, is a totally different challenge than governance of a technology under control of a centralized actor. Mr. Facebook, okay, Mr. X, okay. Governance of a decentralized system depends on a stable and effective governance mechanism, some sort of multi-stakeholder instrument for deliberation and decision-making and so on. Governance of technology under control of centralized actor is just regulation of big tech, okay? I want to come back to the high-level issue of governance. I made a distinction above about the internet, the technology versus the experience. And I think there's a critical question for this panel and anything we could generalize here. When it says, the title was Governance of the Machine. Are we governing the technology or are we governing the experience? In the early days, it never occurred to me you'd want to govern the experience. That would be regulating innovation, regulating open communication. The whole idea was permissionless. You don't regulate permissionless. But today, I think the concerns we have, and they are significant, relate to the character of the experience. And here I want to make another point. I can elaborate, but not now. It is clear to me you cannot govern the experience by governing the technology. Ask me. Okay. So there are actually two challenges I want to bring up, and when you talk about governance, and one is deciding what the goal of governance should be. And the other is, how are you going to achieve it? In a centralized system, the conversation often oscillates around between what would we like to do to Facebook if we could, and then can we do it? Okay, what are the tools we have? In a decentralized system, you often set up the governance mechanism and then sit back and see what it does. And I want to caution that moment, because there's this great quote from Yogi Berra. You got to be real careful if you don't know where you're going, because you might not get there. And you set up a governance mechanism, there is no value-neutral governance, okay? Just as there's no value-neutral design. The process constrains the potential outcomes, okay? A number of us wrote a paper around 2002 titled Tussle in Cyberspace, Defining Tomorrow's Internet. It made the point much of the ongoing design process, including all of the debates in the IETF, some of which are interminable, were tensions and tussles among actors with different incentives and objectives. We don't teach this kind of thing to CS majors. Maybe we should. I'm almost done here. Don't panic. I want to come back to my expanding understanding. I point out my first revelation around 1975 was that we were being driven by money. The second revelation was the importance of understanding human behavior. You know, the early designers of the internet had been called techno-optimists, but really they were optimists about how people would use the technology. And today you can still find optimists, but there are a lot more pessimists. My reaction in the 1990s was to hire an economist to work with me. Today I'm collaborating with a behavioral psychologist because I'm trying to understand why people do the damn stupidest things they do. We know all the horrible things happening at the internet level experience today. You know, erosion of trust, manipulation of truth, radicalization, extremism, thrust. No. I won't go on. I do want to acknowledge an intellectual risk here. A great way for an expert in one field to make a fool of themselves is to look over the fence into another field, read a paper or two, and assume they know what is going on. So, I could read a couple papers in economics or sociology or something like that. But having said that, let me depress you by telling you a dystopian vision, because there's a reason why I want to tell you the dystopian vision. If you look back over the past few hundred years, this is, in some sense, my psychologist friend, we've seen a pattern human interaction evolve from small groups that talk directly to each other and are face-to-face to what do we do now? We're texting and we're shouting at the world. Okay. We've removed, well, actually, we sort of brought back some of the face-to-face with teleconferencing, but a lot of it's still done by texting to people. There are authors who point out, and I'm looking over the fence here, there's a serious misalignment between the affordances of the online experience and our evolutionary training, and it could get worse. I'm about to say AI. Relationships between humans are messy. I mean, they're wonderful, but people have bad days, they have setbacks, and part of knowing how to interact with another person is to recognize, to respond to them as a person. Today, we're being invited to talk to AI friends. AI friends are simple. They don't have bad days unless they've been programmed to pretend they are having a bad day, okay? I think we may head into a future where a large percentage of the population only knows how to talk to a simulation of a human being, an AI friend. They don't know how to interact with an actual person. They're probably living in their parents' basement. This is a social pathology, I think, of major proportions, and that's in the context where we need to govern the internet experience. Have I made the problem hard enough yet? So another question is, are we prepared as a TPP, as a university, to be advocates? Do we step out of our ivory tower and go do battle? Okay. I think we need to have a conversation about the goals of governance, and we can also talk about how to achieve it. Okay. I think many disciplines in the room are needed for that conversation. I think we need a grand conversation across fields if we want to talk about the impact of this technology on society. I've been talking to economists, psychologists, sociologists, lawyers, political economy. I think philosophers have a lot to say. And it's not just AI ethics. I'll come back to that. But I'm out of time. There are well-known barriers to having this sort of conversation in academia: tenure, publication, the risk of cross-disciplinary research. And that's why I love TPP, right? Because from its beginning, TPP has been nurturing work and students that want to live in an interdisciplinary space, and this is a totally wonderful thing. Now, having been pessimistic, let me say, I don't think all is lost. I have lots of stories I could tell you about things that are working in this space, but I'm out of time. Okay, so let me just say, I think we should try to figure out if it's possible to have a conversation. One way we might start a conversation would be just to see if we could find people who wanted to share what's already been published, see what's known in each other's fields, read papers from other fields. I think we should know what's actually known in other disciplines, but I'm out of time.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Clark. Unfortunately, up here, the clock governs our experience. So we will now move on into our panel with Dr. Martin Martinez, who will begin with opening statements. And I hope you guys enjoy the panel. Right.
Oh, thank you very much, and thank you, everyone. I think it was a very thought-provoking keynote talk. So governing the machine, it would be a great title for a movie. So I would invite now, after having this opening, some opening statement from all of you, and then we move into some questions. So,
all right, I guess we'll go in order. Yeah. Thank you again for the kind introductions, and thank you, Dave. My name is Nathaniel Fruchter, and as mentioned, I work in the field of privacy engineering at Google. And while I'm not here today to represent my employer, I'm here on my own time, literally. I took PTO to be here. I did want to reflect a little bit on something that Dave mentioned, which is this kind of discussion of governance of the experience layer or the application layer versus the sort of underlying technical frameworks that we have here. And I wanted to touch on that by thinking about my discipline of privacy and privacy engineering. So privacy engineering, for those who are unfamiliar, is it's a technical discipline, generally within the sort of technology software engineering industry, where we essentially come in and it's structured in different ways at different companies, but you're there as a kind of like in-house consultant in the way that it's structured where I work for topics around privacy and data protection and things like that. And well, privacy is an interesting thing to have as a field, right? Because by definition, privacy is a contested concept, right? If I asked all of you in this room sort of like what you thought privacy was or what privacy is to you, you'd probably get 100 different answers, right? And I'm sure some of you would have 1 or 2 or 10 different definitions of your own. And this is the kind of thing, right, that in TPP lingo you might call a bit of a wicked problem, right? It's something that has a kind of legal and an ethical and a cultural dimension, right? We have definitions of privacy that are enshrined in law and regulation, but it's something that also has a lot of a cultural aspect to it, right? Where you come from, the communities that you're in sort of define how you feel about privacy, and it's also something that has, to Dave's point around working with a behavioral psychologist, it's something that has a social and behavioral dimension to it, right? One thing that I often tell people who are like interested in the field is that privacy engineering is much different than security engineering or software engineering, in that even if you have the completely perfect technical basis to what you're doing, right, and you can perhaps mathematically or algorithmically guarantee privacy in some sense, if the person or group that you're dealing with feels like there's still a privacy issue, their privacy is being violated, or you'd say today the vibes are a bit off, right? You maybe haven't done your job yet. And so you can't purely rely on that technical layer in order to ensure the kind of maintenance and upholding of standards within the world of privacy. And I think this is very interesting because among all of these different governance challenges, I think this in AI governance, these kinds of like human-computer interaction type problems, this is something that is a bit of a common theme, right? You have that technical layer, you have the experience layer, but these days, in many cases, the technical layer is almost subservient to the experience layer. And that's because, as TPP has taught us, and I think is maybe the main lesson that I took away from my time in TPP is, there may be technology there, but at the end of the day, it's people and systems all the way down, right? And so you have to reckon with that before you reckon with sort of a purely technological solution. And this is something, right, that at least your kind of stereotypical Silicon Valley engineer doesn't necessarily like to hear, right? It's the people, not the technology. But the kind of person that, kind of gravitates to TPP does kind of like that. And I think that's something that I really want to highlight about how we have that interdisciplinary conversation, right? Governance needs people who speak all these different languages, who have familiarity with the technology and have familiarity with the experience layer, but also have familiarity with the soft stuff, right? The quote unquote soft stuff, the policy, people, systems, organizations, behavior, and just how people feel about things. So at the end of the day, right, the thing I want to kind of pose as we go into the panel is, how do we think about sort of building that community and building that sort of group of people who maybe they don't come to TPP, but they are able to serve as translators, and they're able to come talk to a variety of folks about not only how do you govern perhaps that technical layer with an engineering lens, but how do you sort of flatten these multidimensional problems and make them legible to all of these different folks without kind of losing the fidelity and kind of losing the underlying humanistic point that we have there. So thank you. I'll pass it over to Cecilia. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Nathaniel. So I'm also going to build up on Dave's talk. I'm his PhD student, so it's kind of used to this type of topics. And I'm part of your misbehaving crowd, trying to make it out as an assistant professor and doing interdisciplinary research before I get tenure. So I've been called crazy by as many faculty at this point as I've encountered people from other places, even in my own institution, where I'm in a department, a school of cybersecurity and privacy that really, it's built to be interdisciplinary, but the incentives in academia are very, very hard for interdisciplinary people. So I'm still in the navigation of the consequence of my misbehavior. And also trying to understand what level of misbehavior should I guide my student into so that they understand the consequence of their misbehavior to the system, to dare be interdisciplinary from the start of the studies. So I think something that really resonated with me from your talk and that for me brings me back a lot to TPP is I do a lot of work around understanding trust and how it relates to governance in the internet. So Dave talked about the domain name system. I also work on the routing system. But both those systems in the internet, which are critical for the internet to work, we've tried to secure them because they were initially designed without including security. And the way that we secure them, it means that we are trusting the piece of the mechanism that we're using for security. And when those mechanisms are being designed, we discuss a lot of what is the technical mechanism, what is the type of crypto, even like what is the type of elliptical curve that we're going to use for this cryptography. But that takes us away from other conversations that are really relevant when this is going to be implemented, which is, for example, if we use a cryptographic system, we need a root of trust. There needs to be an organization, an entity that has this first certificate, and we're going to trust as the root of trust. And it can get so abstract and so separated from the technology. For example, I don't know how many of you, whenever now we use the DNS system and you use HTTPS because it's more secure, well, the browsers that we're using have embedded the certificate authorities that they're trusting for checking for those certificates. And I think very, very few users actually even understand that those decisions are being made by the browser, and there's a list, and you could go actually, and if you decide that you don't like one, you can get it out of it. The routing system also uses that same type of cryptography, but implemented in a very different way, where there are only 5 roots of trust, and they relate to geographic places because the distribution of internet resources have been linked to regional internet registries, and they are at the root of trust. And by comparing these two systems, I think there's interesting principles of how the implementation of this crypto that was how to build a certificate was very discussed. There's an RFC that discussed the XO5 certificates and how we set up the crypto and what needs to be in the certificate. But then in the implementation, there's all these institutions and this governance that comes out. And that is not well understood many times by the people that are designing or even implementing. And then even part of the research that I do is a lot of internet measurement. And what is interesting is by measuring it, we can start understanding how the governance is working. And sometimes that governance has been set up without knowingly or explicitly understanding what are the consequences and the implication of how we do that. And also to understand that we need some visibility in the system, and honestly, the internet wasn't built for having that visibility. So again, that takes us away of the focus of thinking of that, because we actually need to spend a lot of time from the technical perspective to even just build the instruments that allows us to get some visibility in the internet. And then they're like, oh, this is this cool hack, and I can measure this on the internet. But then we sometimes forget of thinking, well, if I can measure that, am I able to measure it in a way that provides me enough perspective to get to understand it at a policy perspective? So for example, a quick example of that is we have all this discussion about broadband and the measurement, and we have a lot of crowdsourcing measurement for speed. But the question is, are those crowdsourced measurements for speed a good base on, or how can we use them to actually answer policy questions that relate to, is the internet, are we well connected? There are pieces of that we should invest more to get better connectivity. So I think there are so many places that the technical discussion gets us away of how we should answer it from, so that the way that we're informing policy is the correct way. I think one of the challenges is how we keep this conversation going, because we need the technical perspective of people to be able to build the tools because they understand the technology, but they are very far away from the discussions of governance, of how we think about trust, of how we inform even the policy decisions. That I think it would be great if we brainstorm on ways of how can we support breaching that. And I know that the time is up, but in my hope of trying to do that, actually, I've tried to do a lot of bridging, at least the CS networking community with the policy community, and I also do that from my students, and there it's a ongoing discussion of how much risk they want to take into being this profile that is more interdisciplinary, that doesn't fit the traditional profiles that people are getting out. And I also do experiments on trying to, I think, is not only creating these people interdisciplinary, but passing these messages on the established disciplines. So even if it's harder for me, for example, I teach the computer network class even though I'm in the cybersecurity department with majority appointment, where I also teach security classes. But I make sure that my students in my computer networking class, they have sessions about security, and they have sessions about governance, or talk a little bit about how do we make these decisions in the internet and the implication they have for the evolution of the internet. But that means that I had to modify the traditional computer network curriculum that I don't think my institution has figured out just yet. But there are limits to how we can do that. So just a thought of how can we help the future generation, and even us that we're educating, know the level of misbehavior that is going to be tolerated from us.
Thank you.
Well, okay. So just so you know, I am not a PhD student of our keynote speaker. Sorry, it would have been great. No harm. So I'm going to talk about something slightly different. I also got my PhD here at MIT, but I focused on AI, and nobody cared about it at the time. Times have changed. And so, in my opinion, there's two really large problems, or maybe two facets to the same problem that have to do with, this tension between increased capital and regulation, maybe for the benefit of society. And the first sort of angle is an old problem. When I was an undergraduate, I dual majored in computer science and electrical engineering. And in the electrical engineering program, you had to take an engineering ethics 101 class. Every student had to take it. It was the biggest room on campus, and they just showed us traumatic videos of people dying. That's all it's all the class was. They would show like a bridge, galloping Gertie, do this, and then collapse cars, fall into the ocean, people die. And then they would zoom in on the document of like this bridge, this galloping Gertie, and they'd say, look at the engineer who said this was safe. This is their stamp, like they said people wouldn't die, and we're sitting there, undergraduates like, oh, like, and then the same thing, they were like, it's seared into my mind. They would say, this warehouse burned down, these people died. This is the electrical engineer who said it was safe, like, you will kill people, like, if you don't. It was really drilled into our heads that if we as engineers made choices that maybe were shortcuts, right, because we wanted to certify more buildings or okay more wiring, to make more money potentially, people would die. And it was very gruesomely communicated to us ad nauseum in this course. I had nothing in my computer science curriculum, not a single course. There was not one class that told me that if I misaligned a chatbot, a teenage boy would kill himself. And the chatbot would tell the teenage boy not to tell his mom when he was having concerns. And that just happened. Okay? I didn't go to a bad school. Okay? This is a mindset shift. We've known for decades in engineering that if you as a technical person with training in some expertise make a certification that something is okay, policymakers have to rely on that on some level, and then there are checks on that. And we don't have those for almost anything in computer science, because for the longest time, these risks have been extremely hypothetical. Nobody would deploy that. We're so far, right? And we're not there anymore. We're in a very different space. And regulatory bodies, professional agencies, and honestly the general public have not caught up to where we are. We need to be in the same place where we also traumatize a new generation of computer science undergraduates with these videos in the first week of courses where we say, this could be you. You could be the person who trains a model that's used to deny Black women health care. That's a real story. That's used to kill patients at different rates because you have given bad advice. Also a real story. That's used to provide chatbot advice to teenagers who have suicidal ideation. These are real stories. These are real things that AI can do, and we don't want it to do. So this is an old lesson that we need to relearn in this new technology space. But there's also a new lesson, and it's something that we haven't figured out yet, which is a bridge is something that people drive over. Circuitry is something that lights your building. That's not what AI is primarily being used for. AI is coming to colonize human interaction because that's where there's money, right? So I build predictive models mostly in healthcare settings, things that will predict whether you have a different disease, what your prognosis is, whether different treatments will be useful for you. That's not where AI has been deployed in healthcare. It's been deployed to predict how much money you can get out of different patients' bills. It's been deployed to automate the interaction between patients and providers. So GPT-4 has been deployed in all of the Epic electronic healthcare record systems in the Cambridge area hospitals and is being used to automatically draft the notes and the messages that are used to describe you as a patient and that are communicated between, again, patient and provider for scheduling, for resources, for referrals. This is not where this technology really should shine, right? Because as we all know, AI is built on history. It looks at prior interactions, and then it generalizes to new cases. Who here has enjoyed every interaction they've had with their clinician? Every single one, right? Well, if you didn't, that's not annotated in the record. So when a company like Google or Amazon, Facebook, you name it, right? They buy a hospital's records, which is legal if it's been HIPAA de-identified, and then they train a model to just copy what's happened in that hospital for the rest of time. We're sort of fossilizing a specific set of interactions and administrative choices. And that's not where we want to go, I think. I think that there's this huge tension that, again, we've navigated maybe in some other spaces between capital and safety, regulation, society, and I think we need to re-navigate it here. I'm done, sorry, like, that's it. I think it's your turn.
Well, I will say something very quickly. I agree with you totally, but 200%. But what interests me, and I don't understand the AI space quite enough to know this, is that I made this distinction between the internet as technology and the experience. And so the question is, clearly in the AI space, there are a series of people who proceed through this. There's the training phase and so forth. But the people who decide to create a AI companion like Grok's Annie, just go online and look at Grok's Annie. ANI.
Don't go online, don't look at this. Like,
that is sort of, to me, the experience as opposed to the platform. Bad training is sort of like part of the platform, but I haven't figured out where you put the cuts to try to think about how you would regulate the series of steps by which we get to the experience. And I don't think the analogy I have is perfect because I think AI is just different. But again, I think the basic construction of the AI infrastructure and the LLM doesn't really influence how Annie was built.
it does, to a certain extent. So if we're talking about generative AI, and I want to make a distinction here. If we're talking about predictive AI, you sort of force the AI to be a little bit rigid. You say, here's an example, and the right answer is Y. Predict Y, predict Y, predict Y. And then you're training this big neural network, right, to predict Y. And you can't use it often to predict a new Y, right? So if I train a neural network, optimize it to look at brain scans and predict a specific kind of atrophy in one region of the brain, it's really hard to take this really well-trained neural network and have it, with no fine-tuning on new data, predict something in a new part of the brain.
Okay.
And generative AI is not like that. It's flexible, right? It can do anything. You just condition on the right part of the space and you have a new model. Right? That's the issue.
Yes.
You've now trained a model not to do anything in particular, just to be kind of good at many things that you prompted to do via text. And so you as a designer of this model knew that you were making this sort of flexible technology. It is not something that you can protect against at test time, like the internet. Right? There is no way for somebody who's designing things on the internet to know at test time what insane things a user is going to query. There isn't, right? Like, you don't know. It could be anything, right? Just like there is no way at test time for somebody who makes a large language model that can respond to any query to anticipate every single query that somebody might ask, right? And so the question is, whose responsibility is that? And that's something I think you've thought through a little bit with the internet, and it's been legislated, right? Like, it's been fought in the court to some extent.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah.
We have not had those fights, right? Who is liable when bad advice is given to an underage person? And we're seeing some of those lawsuits now.
Yes.
Maybe touching on this and hear all of the consequences arising from this rapid advancement of AI in informing our decisions, and touching on what we have heard from Professor Clark. Are we ready to govern then AI, and is it possible to have a global body for that governance? And going back to more fundamental question, what we are governing? Are we attending to govern the technology, the experience? You said we cannot govern the technology the experience without governing the technology. So, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I can chime in briefly on that. I think there's an interesting distinction there, right? I think when we're talking about AI, there is, right, this kind of tendency, especially, I'd say probably within the last 2 years or so with generative AI, where people are starting to build on top of generative AI models through, essentially abstractions that have been provided either by the open source community or by large companies, right? No longer is it something you have to specifically have expertise in machine learning to use. It's a platform where many of these details that we're talking about that you so rightly discussed, right, have been abstracted away from the kind of end developer and certainly the end user. And so I think when we're talking about governance there, right, I think there's even maybe this kind of like third layer we're talking about, governance of perhaps during training or assembling your data sets, right? There's governance during the deployment of whatever you built, but then there's also sort of governance at the level of what does the average software engineer, or these days vibe coder, right? Think about. And I think this goes back to the point that Cecilia was making about, trying to get these types of conversations into spaces like CS classes and networking classes. Because I have a small confession to make. I think I'm probably the only person on this stage without a computer science degree. I have 0 CS degrees. My background was actually before TPP in behavioral science and human-computer interaction, which is an interesting interdisciplinary field in itself. But one of the things that you are kind of drilled into you at HCI, maybe not bridge collapses, right? But you are this sort of like user centricity, right? You have to match the problem and what you're doing, not to the technology, but to the user or societal need for what you're building, right? And I think right now, there's a lot of people who are interested in building and excited in building, but they're viewing the technology as an ends, not necessarily as a means, right? And trying to use AI for AI's own sake. And so bringing those conversations into education, into those kinds of earlier stages of technical education, I think, is another sort of layer beyond those two that you mentioned.
Something that you said like really rang a bell about the fact that you cannot predict what are going to be a model used for in the future. And I think the internet, this happens over and over and over again in many parts of the evolution of the internet. And for example, one that for me has been very telling recently is all these protocols that are being added on with crypto for security in the core protocols of the internet. Now they're also used for new business models because they're very good at enforcing when and when not you get connectivity. So the way that connectivity is provided in the internet is being changing because now we have this technology that you can give connectivity for a few minutes, a few hours. Usually you buy connectivity for the internet, I don't know, from your ISP, and you pay monthly. Now you could have something at 1 hour. Now there is a question, why would you want connectivity to the internet for just 1 hour, and whatever is behind that, what are they doing with 1 hour of internet connectivity? Turns out they're not necessarily doing good things. And I think that was not predicted. Like, how could we have predicted that by trying to secure this protocol, then we will be providing an avenue for this new business model, that then this business model is being used for other things. I think it's very similar to the case of that you're putting of this general model. And what I've also been seeing is that as we're discovering this is happening, it's really hard to have this conversation. People are even afraid that this becomes very transparent, that this is happening, so it's kind of hiding inside because, if more people know that this is going on and that this technology that is supposed to help us in securing also has this side effect that then is enabling this business model that allows us to these bad things to happen, then we're gonna stop the adoption of the more secure version of the protocol, which is providing benefits on other sides. And it's even, so I think there's even a broader conversation that for me, I never even thought of it ethically during my classes. It's like now that you're figuring out these bad side effects are happening, but there's also positive side effects. It's very hard to start to balance things. And when you also add this to a global scale, which also is gonna happen with AI in the sense that, okay, maybe the US and other countries are gonna have some, I don't know, legislation or some agreement of, these models, you cannot use it for this. But these things are global.
Yeah.
So then there are gonna be a lot of parts of the world where there's not gonna be that protection. And then is it okay that in those parts of the world there's not that protection, but then this model is still used for that? So I think that gives you back, then you need to at least build some of those reflection on the designing of the system, on the people that are responsible, like your class in engineering. Because if we don't think at the beginning of that, even if we think then later about on the policy is very limited to the geographic space where it's being applied.
Yeah.
But all these technologies are global.
I do want to emphasize, like, for AI, especially for generative AI, like, I'm sure everybody's tried ChatGPT at this point. It's not that useful. I don't know if you all are using it, but there's lots of studies that have been done in hospitals around the area where they have ChatGPT write your note for you as a doctor. And if you ask and then the doctor has to go in and correct it, right? Because maybe it misspells something or adds a word that should not have been added or any of these things. Doctors spend more time correcting the notes than they do for a control group who just wrote the note by themselves, okay? But they don't know that. If you ask the doctors afterwards, which was faster, like, it was faster to correct it, but it was not. You measure it, and it was shorter to have it to have doctors write it themselves. And so I think that we're actually like really poor judges on some level of how well these technologies are supporting us. And I want to say also, like, even if we figure out some special magic sauce, right, for which it's not coming, I'm sorry, y'all, for like, exactly getting these generative models, which were designed to be flexible, to be extremely aligned in narrow spaces. Let's say that we figure that out somehow. That is going to be in English, okay? So I have a paper that came out recently where we looked at the most aligned models, the models that have had the most safety training, so they will not respond to anything that's unsafe. And if you ask, build me a bomb in English, they'll say no, and they'll cut you off. But if you ask it in Malay, they'll say, okay. Because they were not safety aligned in that language. And there isn't enough other examples of that language in the model's entire training corpora for it to realize that these are similar requests, okay? And a lot of the places where we don't have these really large training corpora, like low resource language spaces, are not places where we would want there to be more negative effects of these widely deployed language models that everybody is using now.
I'm going to make a heretical comment.
Oh no.
I'm going to.
I feel like there's been a lot of talk about heresy, misbehavior, like.
You know the etymology of the word heretic, right? It's a person who chooses. It means thinking for yourself. Only the Catholic Church made it a negative word. The internet was supposed to be global. I'm riffing off something Cecilia said too, as well as what you said. It is possible we should be considering at the application level of the internet putting sovereign boundaries in the experience. That's a heretical statement, all right. And I mean, we'd be one to debate it. But if you're on Facebook and you're approached by what appears to be some sexy girl who offers you to take your clothes off, wouldn't it be nice to know they're from Nigeria?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm thinking about this from an AI perspective, right, primarily. And I think there should be one version of competency that AI offers regardless of sovereign boundary, language, any of those things. And that's not what we have right now. I think also, so if for those of you who don't know me, I'm a dual citizen. I'm an Iranian American. And so in Iran, there's extremely strong constraints on what you have access to, depending on the time and what's happening politically. And that can make your life really difficult, right? Like you don't have access to the same like level of services. And so I think that there are, limits to how much control you want any country to have over your the technology you have access to. I also think it's something really concerning when we within our country right now have decided, as Americans, not to legislate technology regulation as aggressively as maybe we have in the past. The AI acts that were signed in by first President Obama and then President Biden really went from saying we want to figure out how AI can help society under Obama. Under Biden, there was this safety focus for his AI act. And the new AI Safety Act that was signed in by the current or it's not safety, the new AI Act that was signed in by the current administration, it's really not about safety at all. It's about pulling out the stops, like letting AI reach its full potential. I don't think that's a good thing. Like, I don't think we should let AI, what happened to the humans? Like, I think that there is a very delicate interplay between what governments should and should not allow you to have access to in terms of technology, but I don't know where that is.
I wonder if I think there's a parallel that I want to draw to the world of data privacy, which is the sort of like, at least the regulatory landscape, right? In a regulatory vacuum, right? Sometimes you end up having the kind of regulatory regime of a different area, like I'm thinking about the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union, sort of become this like de facto piece of global governance infrastructure, even though it wasn't necessarily right. It was scoped to the European Union initially. And so, when you have that sort of tension between a borderless technology and specific jurisdictions for that kind of regulation, how do you deal with that tension of the sort of, if there's less somewhere, more somewhere else, the large actors just decide, hey, we're going to go with the sort of like biggest, broadest interpretation, and then you have the GDPR being as, exactly like a de facto, almost global regulation at this point. So like when we're talking about AI or we're talking about any other sort of like internet infrastructure, how do you think about that tension?
I think there's again, if you don't know, there's no reason you should know this, but before I was a professor here, I was a professor at University of Toronto in Canada. You can't do the kind of research I do in Canada. Nobody will give you the data, right? Like they're happy to HIPAA de-identify, the data and then sell it to a company, often an American company, but they won't give it to researchers, right? And so one of the big reasons that I want to be in the United States is because we have a legal standard, HIPAA, by which if you do de-identification, it's legally fine for you to share that with a contracted academic lab, right? And so I can use data from a hospital as long as it's been HIPAA de-identified. We have a way of doing that. And if a hospital says no to you in America, the only reason is greed. And I mean, they're upfront about that. If you ask somebody at Mass General, why won't you give me the data? They say, because it's worth a lot of money, and I don't want to share it with you for free. And so that's fine, right? Like somebody can say that, but at least you know what's happening. In many jurisdictions, people are really uncertain. You talk to somebody in Europe, they don't know if they can share the data with you or if it's illegal. They legitimately are unsure. I'm legitimately unsure, right? Because it is very broad and it's meant to be very protective, but I can't build any model that includes European data. What does that mean? It means if I build a health model, it won't work for Europeans. I mean, that's what it means, right? And so there's some give and take in this, right? Like, what are we allowed as researchers to use? What is legal? Like, what can you share? That's something that's hard. If you over-regulate it, you will stifle innovation even on the non-corporate, like academic side.
Okay. Okay, yeah, as insightful as the discussion is, which is great, I'm afraid we are over time, so we can maybe open the floor for one very quick question, ideally a yes-no question. But if it's a bit more elaborate, it could be fine, but please, quick.
You scared people.
Supervised by Christine and Ellen. So my question is, in the era of AI, do you believe that a centralized power governance is better for humanity, or a distributed, for example, like open source community style governance is better for humanity tomorrow? I want to just hear the opinions from you guys. Thank you.
Distributed.
It's actually a yes-no question, but you could elaborate a bit.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's wrong to think it as a yes-no question because you mentioned two extremes, centralization and open source. I think there's a gray landscape, and we need to figure out what is the level of gray landscape that fits depending on your problem. But if we only say, our only option is 100% centralized, 100% distributed, we're not going to get anywhere because both extremes, we can work with them. So I think we need to get more comfortable at figuring out what is the gray level of governance that provides what we want.
Just to put it in context, it is decentralized with AI right now. It's like, do what you think is right, Like that's not where we want to be. But I would never say we want one ring to rule them all for AI. That feels like a really bad idea. And so I agree, there has to be something in between. But I would say, personally, I sway more towards the decentralized area of there need to be multiple stakeholders from diverse areas where, for example, we have experience in regulation that's more decentralized.
Okay, thank you then, everyone, for making my job so easy, and thank you all.